All right, let's talk about the M1 Mac Minis. I set out to challenge myself to only be using the Mac Mini for 15 days straight without going back to the Intel-based Mac at all. And much to my surprise, the 15 days actually went by pretty quickly. Coincidentally, completely a coincidence. Coincidentally, the 15 days is also the return period for Apple Canada. But I do not actually plan on returning my Mac Mini because I like it so much. And I see a lot of people talking about the problems, the issues they're facing. I consider the lucky guy who has very few problems with the Mac Mini. And I'm pretty sure right after I said that, I'm gonna start seeing more problems because I just jinxed myself. You probably see a lot of people talk about the Bluetooth issues with the Mac Minis or Mac in general. I've had quite a few Bluetooth issues on my previous Intel-based Mac, but surprisingly, the Mac Mini handled Bluetooth pretty well for me. So I actually don't have as many Bluetooth issues as the others have. Now I do have another very annoying issue that I encounter very often with the M1 Mac Mini, which is this weird display issue. Let me pull it up. You see, every time I wake the screen up from sleep, I see this weird resolution change in the displays. I have two monitors connected, and the main display, it just has this weird display issue whenever I wake the screen up. And when I say whenever, it's not like every time. It's not like every time 100% of the time. It's actually 8 out of 10 times, which is still very annoying. It's a lot. It's happening more than it should. So what happens is, whenever I wake the screen up from sleep, I see the resolution. First of all, the resolution changes on the display, and second is it scales itself up, or for some reason it's just like even going out of the bounds of the monitor itself. So I have zero clue why this is happening, but I do know one fix for it, a temporary workaround for it, which is to unplug and plug the external monitor back in again. And I have to do that 8 out of 10 times after I wake the machine up from sleep. That is very annoying, but I have to say that is the only very annoying problem for me with the M1 Mac Mini. Now I have to say this is the first Mac Mini I've ever owned. I've been using the MacBook Pro line for the past years because I really love the flexibility and just being able to bring my workstation everywhere I go. I pretty much have a fully loaded office where I have a giant external monitor for the MacBook Pro, and I have a fully automatic standing desk. But this still, a lot of times I prefer working in a coffee shop with just my MacBook Pro and nothing else. And sometimes I can 10x my productivity just going to a coffee shop instead of being in this fully loaded office that I spent so much time upgrading every piece of it. But now that we're all forced to stay at home and traveling was a thing, it's past tense, I don't really think the portability and flexibility of a laptop really factors into the whole consideration of getting a new machine anymore. At least for the next year or so, I'm not gonna go anywhere, especially when I work remotely. And I got this 11-inch iPad Pro with the Apple Pencil and the Magic Keyboard. So the portability aspect really doesn't factor into the consideration anymore. Now, if you think I am an Apple shill, I wouldn't mind being one, but I've been using Samsung phones. Oh, you can see myself. I can see myself. I've been using a Samsung phone for as long as I have owned a Mac. And I have, where's my buds? And I use the Samsung buds. Come on, focus. There you go. In fact, I have every generation of the Samsung buds. I have a problem with buying earbuds. But I am trying to be completely, why do I see your feet? But now I'm trying to be completely unbiased here with my opinions on the new M1 Mac Mini. I'm speaking to you as someone who values productivity, and I just want to get things done. I don't really want the operating system or the hardware to bog me down when I'm trying to implement a software feature or trying to fix a bug very urgently, or just relax and binge watch some tech YouTube videos. I don't want to focus on the tools that help me relax or help me get work done. I wanted to get out of the way. The best system, the best tools actually gets out of the way. So I love the customizability and familiarity with the Android system, but when it comes to desktop computing, I still cannot get away from Mac. I just can't ever get Windows to cooperate with me. It's like Windows is like an obsessed sociopath who's constantly trying to grab and keep hold of my attention at all times. And when I'm finally done with the software issues, I find myself having to deal with hardware or driver issues. But anyway, this is not a rant about Windows. But coming back to the M1 Mac Mini, I actually feel like this is the first step Apple has taken in years to make people feel like they're using a Mac again. This is what I mean. For the past year, I've been using the 16-inch MacBook Pro. It's not even the base model, it's the mid-tier of the MacBook Pro line with 1 terabyte of SSD, 16 gigs of RAM, and an Intel i9 8-core processor. This is some impressive specs, even for a Windows machine, even for a PC. Yet my computer was freezing 3 times a week. Like freezing, not I see the beach ball of death freezing, but like completely freezing up the entire machine. I cannot even interact with it, completely just locked out almost. And I'm basically, at that point, I'm basically seeing a screenshot of the machine. My interactions are not getting any feedback, and nothing I do is amounting to anything. Now imagine you're on a Zoom meeting with 10 other people, looking to hear your answers to their questions. And all you could do is just sit there and panic because your MacBook Pro has just turned into a fancy picture frame. And I've owned 4 MacBook Pros so far, and I really don't feel like Apple is improving their operating system or software much anymore. I kid you not, the most reliable and performant, yes, you heard that right, performant Mac I've ever used is a base model 2014 15-inch MacBook Pro. The 2019 16 gig mid-tier MacBook Pro doesn't even come close to the performance of that 2014 machine, which is just mind-boggling. And I don't really care about the benchmarks or the performance numbers because those are really meaningless to me compared to my actual experience doing daily tasks. Now I've got my 15-inch 2014 MacBook Pro for 5 years until I started to see more hiccups with the system. I can count in one hand how many times my 2014 MacBook Pro froze on me completely in the past 5 years, and that's less than 5 times. I've had my 16-inch MacBook Pro freeze up 5 times in a month. That is unacceptable. It became a nightmare. Now my experience with the new M1 Mac Mini is pretty much the opposite, the polar opposite of what I had experienced on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And mind you, the 16-inch Mac Mini I got is less than half the price of the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I almost got that magical feeling when I first started using the Mac. I was a complete Windows fanatic, but just the simple fact that I can sleep a Mac computer and wake it up and have no weird bugs or no crazy display issues was mind-blowing to me compared to using a Windows machine. It was the first time I didn't have to shut down a computer every night. So the feeling of first using a Mac was almost too good to be true to me. Once again, the tool or the operating system gets out of the way when I need to get stuff done. And now with the M1 Mac Minis, the OS finally gets out of the way once again. For the most part anyway, except for that really annoying display bug I keep on seeing. And so far, using the M1 Mac Mini has been a dream. And here are a list of things I keep running at the same time every single day. I have 3 web servers running. They're not all doing heavy processing all the time, but they're constantly running and using up a little bit of resources here and there. I never have less than 30 Chrome tabs open. I also have multiple instances of Visual Studio Code open. VS Code sometimes indexes files and does some really heavy background processing, but I really don't notice it anymore. On the MacBook Pro, whenever VS Code would index, my fan will kick on. I can probably cook an egg sunny side up on the keyboard. And now I forget I have a computer running for the most part. because it almost feels like this thing doesn't even have a fan inside. And it doesn't feel, there's not even warmth coming out of this machine. When I touch it, it feels cold, like a solid block of aluminum in room temperature. I also have Slack running most of the time, and Slack was notoriously resource heavy, resource hungry until a couple versions ago, so it's really not a big deal anymore, but just thought I'd throw that in there. I also have Final Cut Pro running in the background because now I started putting out more videos. Obviously, Final Cut Pro is not constantly rendering, but even if it is rendering, I don't really notice because, again, the Mac Mini doesn't like to announce its existence. It doesn't like to grab attention like a Windows PC does. And with all of that running at the same time, I have Zoom calls at least 3 times a week, sometimes 3 times a day, and sometimes 2 calls spanning 5 hours in total. And like Slack, Zoom has improved their resource management quite a bit, so they're not using as many resources as before. But right before I switched to the Mac Mini, which is 15 days ago, my 16-inch MacBook Pro would still freeze up the computer entirely when Zoom is running. Now, theoretically speaking, an 8-core Intel i9 with 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte of SSD, it is a beast of a machine. And theoretically, I should never have to worry about freezing or storage space or anything with that kind of specs on paper. But reality is always cruel. Now, before I got this Mac Mini, I did try the 8GB version of the M1 Mac Mini. It wasn't amazingly performant. There are a couple hiccups here and there, but overall, it performed much better than the 16GB MacBook Pro. And that 8GB M1 Mac Mini was 1/4 of the price of the 16GB MacBook Pro. And now that I've swapped the 8GB Mac Mini with the 16GB Mac Mini, I'm just coasting through everything. I don't really have to worry about managing my resources. I don't have to remember to free up memory or to sit there and wait for the expensive processing to finish before I can do things smoothly. And that, I would say, is completely worth it. And that's pretty much it. If you're in a similar situation as me, I would say just stop procrastinating, stop watching all these reviews, and just go buy one and try it out. And depending on the Mac you currently have, you may actually be making money when you switch to the new M1 Mac Mini. Just make sure to check if everything you need is compatible with the new M1 chip, the new Apple Silicon architecture, before you actually sell your old Mac. So I got the 16GB M1 Mac Mini for around $1,500 Canadian after tax. Now I traded in the 2014 MacBook Pro for 480 Canadian. And if I wanted to, I could easily sell my 16-inch MacBook Pro, mid-tier, remember, for around $3,000 Canadian. Because I really take good care of this thing. I've got a case on it, I've got a screen protector on the screen. So the finances work out very well for me. And for the most part, the most important part, I don't have to worry about debugging the machine when I need to get work done anymore. Alright, I hope the information in this video helps you make an informed decision and just stop procrastinating and go buy the M1 Mac Mini, please. I'm not an affiliate, I promise. Although I should probably. Well, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.